Captain Jim Wallace could not believe what he was looking at. These Australians had just wrecked their own rifles. They had cut the barrels short, hacked off the stocks, and turned precision weapons into something that looked like scrap metal. Wallace had completed 3 tours in Southeast Asia. He understood jungle warfare, and he knew exactly what the Australians were carrying. None of it made sense to him. The barrels were far too short for accuracy, he told an Australian warrant officer, unable to hide the condescension in his voice. You are losing velocity and range. Why would you ruin a perfectly good rifle? The Australian simply smiled. He did not argue, and he did not explain. He just smiled and walked away. What happened 16 days later would force Captain Wallace to question everything he had learned in 3 years of combat. But to understand why that moment mattered, it is important to understand exactly what the Australians had done to their weapons and why American Special Forces believed it was insane. The Australian L1A1 self-loading rifle was already controversial. It was heavier than the American M16, longer and more difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. In jungle combat, it appeared to be the wrong choice. The Americans had designed the M16 to be light, compact, and ideal for close quarters fighting in dense vegetation, but the Australian SAS took their already questionable rifle and made it even worse, at least in American eyes. They cut the 21-inch barrel down to just past the gas block, roughly 10 or 11 inches. They removed the full wooden stock and replaced it with a skeleton frame. They filed down the selector to convert the semi-automatic rifle to full automatic fire. They mounted 30-round magazines and sometimes added a forward pistol grip or even an XM148 grenade launcher underneath. The Australian troops called this creation the Bitch, and the nickname was well-deserved. The shortened barrel, combined with full auto fire, made the rifle nearly impossible to control. The twisting bolt action and reduced weight caused the weapon to climb violently the moment the trigger was pulled. Accuracy was non-existent. You could not keep it on target. When Captain Wallace saw these weapons at a forward staging area outside Phuoc Tu province in early May 1968, his reaction was professional concern mixed with contempt. He believed these men were going to get themselves killed. American advisors who saw the Australian SAS preparing for patrol exchanged looks, shook their heads, and made jokes. Some said it looked like the Australians could not afford proper weapons. Others joked they planned to beat Charlie to death with them. The Australians ignored the mockery. They loaded their packs, checked their maps, and vanished into the jungle. What the Americans did not understand was that the Australians were not trying to build an accurate rifle. They were building an ambush weapon. Australian SAS doctrine in Vietnam was completely different from American tactics. American units often moved in larger formations, engaged in prolonged firefights, and relied on air support and artillery. The Australians operated in tiny patrols of 4 or 5 men deep inside enemy territory, sometimes for weeks. Their goal was not to fight. It was to collect intelligence, track enemy movements, and when absolutely necessary, launch devastating ambushes that ended before the enemy understood what was happening. For this style of warfare, they did not need a rifle that could hit targets at 300 meters. They needed a weapon that could unleash an overwhelming volume of fire at extremely close range, between 10 and 30 meters, delivered so suddenly and violently that the enemy would be dead or fleeing before organizing a response. That was the purpose of the Bitch. The shortened barrel reduced weight and bulk in the jungle. Full automatic fire meant maximum bullets immediately. Uncontrollable recoil did not matter, because precision was not the goal. The intent was to create a wall of lead that would obliterate everything inside a narrow kill zone. This idea was difficult for American advisors to accept because they had been taught that accuracy defined effectiveness. Bravo 2, an Australian SAS patrol, had been tracking a Viet Cong supply column for 16 hours 40 Enemy fighters were moving supplies from a cache area to forward positions. The patrol commander, Sergeant Barry Tiny Peters, violated American doctrine by paralleling the column throughout the night without engaging. He observed them, studied their behavior, and learned their patterns. By dawn, he predicted their route and destination. He positioned his 5-man patrol on Route 328, about 2 kilometers north of Bin Ba village. Then they waited for hours, completely motionless, allowing the jungle to settle and their presence to disappear. When the Viet Cong entered the area, the Australians were invisible. The enemy walked straight into the kill zone, unaware. The ambush lasted 4 minutes. The Australians opened fire with their modified rifles. The shortened L1A1S thundered, unloading magazines of 7.62 millimeter rounds into the tightly packed column at point-blank range. The sound was overwhelming, and the results devastating. The Viet Cong attempted to return fire, but could not see their attackers. The Australians had positioned themselves so effectively, using terrain and vegetation, that even muzzle flashes were concealed or misdirected. Some enemy fighters tried to escape, but Peters had anticipated this and radioed for a blocking force along the likely escape route. The fleeing Viet Cong ran directly into it when the firing stopped. The results were staggering. 20 Viet Cong were dead, 8 to 10 were wounded, and 8 more were captured. Australian casualties were 0. The patrol also captured valuable intelligence, including supply records, unit identifiers, and tunnel locations. Total ammunition expended was less than 500 rounds. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. The enemy never even identified the exact ambush position. 3 weeks earlier, an American SAS team had carried out a similar ambush on Route 2, about 30 kilometers north, targeting a Viet Cong supply column. They killed 12 enemy fighters, but suffered 2 casualties during a counterattack. They fired over 800 rounds called in gunship support and required extraction under fire. When Captain Wallace reviewed the Australian after-action report, his first response was disbelief. He said there was no way they got that close. After aerial reconnaissance confirmed the body locations and patrol position, his reaction changed to astonishment. He asked how they managed it. The answer lay in everything the Americans had mocked. The modified rifles were only one part of a complete tactical system, developed through hard experience. In Malaya, Borneo, and Vietnam, the Australians moved differently, slower, quieter, and more deliberately. They did not crash through the jungle. They blended into it. They tracked patiently, methodically, and predicted enemy behavior rather than reacting. Impulsively, they set ambushes with perfect positioning, waited for the ideal moment, and unleashed violence so sudden and overwhelming that the enemy could not respond effectively. Their weapons were optimized for short-range, high-intensity brief combat. Captain Wallace was a professional soldier, and he could admit when he was wrong. After witnessing the results, he began paying close attention to Australian methods. He noticed that Australian SAS patrols in Phuoc Thu province were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. Between June and December 1968, they recorded 43 enemy killed and only 3 Australian fatalities, a ratio of 134 to 1. American Special Forces were highly capable, but no one was achieving results like that. Wallace began asking real questions. How do you move that quietly? How do you predict enemy movement? How do you use patience as a weapon? The Australians shared what they knew informally, not through manuals, but through experience. Veteran SAS team leaders passed techniques to American advisors who were willing to learn. By late 1968, some American units operating with limited oversight began making small weapon modifications, reducing flash, shortening stocks, and lowering weapon profiles. Wallace himself went from skeptic to believer to outspoken advocate. He promoted Australian methods in every briefing he gave. Story of the Bitch is not really about rifles. It is about the danger of assuming you already know everything. American forces in Vietnam relied on tactics and weapons built through extensive research testing and doctrine, and those choices made sense. The M16 was in many ways an excellent jungle weapon, but the Australians had something else experience. They had been fighting communist insurgencies in jungle environments since the Malayan emergency, and learned harsh lessons in Borneo. By the time they arrived in Vietnam, they had spent over a decade refining small unit jungle warfare tactics. When American advisors mocked the modified rifles, they were really dismissing a tactical system they did not understand. The weapons looked wrong only because they were judged through American doctrine. The Australians followed their own doctrine forged through years of jungle combat, tailored to their mission profile. In that context, the bitch made perfect sense. The modified L1A1 rifles became legendary, not just because they worked, but because they symbolized adaptability and the willingness to break. Rules when necessary official doctrine said you do not cut barrels or alter selectors or turn precision weapons into uncontrolled bullet hoses. But the Australian SAS cared about survival and mission success. If that required a weapon that looked absurd but performed perfectly, they accepted it. Eventually, the Australian military formalized some of these ideas with the L1A1 F1 variant, featuring a shortened stock and modified flash suppressor. But by then the SAS had already moved on to new adaptations. That is the real lesson. The best special forces units are not the ones that follow doctrine blindly. They are the ones that understand their mission deeply enough to adapt or abandon doctrine entirely. Captain Wallace learned this lesson in May 1968, watching a 5-man Australian patrol achieve results that seemed impossible. Those men with sawed rifles had just executed one of the most effective ambushes of the Vietnam War, using weapons that by every rule Wallace had learned should not have worked. If you found this story eye-opening, check out my next video, The Silent Killers. How New Zealand SAS hunted North Vietnamese officers for 72 hours without firing a shot. It is another powerful example of Commonwealth Special Forces rewriting the rule book in Vietnam.